What I want to do is talk a bit about public attitudes to risk and the way that public attitudes to risk have developed and the way that has had an impact on the way that actuaries advise on pensions and the way that pension schemes work. So that might sound a bit of an odd thing to try to do, but that is precisely what I am going to do. And I'm going to base it largely on quite a lengthy article I wrote for the American magazine Contingencies, which you can find should you want to read more about this, but I'm going to do a gallop through because I have limited time available to me today. So when you think about a popular understanding of risk, there's two things that I think are really important to grasp. And the first is that whilst originally risk was a kind of neutral word, you could have good risks and bad risks. Today we have a kind of society that's transformed in a way that only ever sees risk as a negative thing, as something to be eliminated, something to be got rid of, reduced, managed down. So that kind of difference in the understanding of what we mean by risk is I think, quite a new thing, quite a modern thing if we look historically. It's quite hard to date it precisely, but I would date it to around the late 80s, early 90s. If you kind of think back to what was happening then with the fall of the Berlin Wall, we had Francis Fukuyama's book, The End of History, which kind of claimed we'd seen the end of ideology, the universalisation of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. And that was a kind of intellectual exponent of this idea. The kind of more Street Fighter idea of this kind of way of thinking was Margaret Thatcher's idea that there is no alternative. There is no alternative to the market. And what I'd say both of those things do is they bring together the idea that there's a loss of belief in human agency. It kind of pushes the notion that trying to act on the world to change it is a kind of hubristic thing to do. It's doomed to failure. And that kind of pushes into the idea that taking risk is not a good thing. And you saw the kind of corporate version of that in the institutionalisation of a kind of safety first idea. So this is when we, certainly in the mid-90s, we first got the idea of corporate risk officers, chief risk officers within organisations, who would kind of, be the people who would be battening down risk in all areas of a business. So that's the first thing I think we need to understand about the way that popular understanding of risk has changed. The second really important thing and this is where it's the kind of terminology gets quite difficult. The second thing that's really important to understand is that there's been a real change of of this term risk. It's a tricky little word, this risk. And I would argue that historically there was a technical understanding of risk as meaning a probability of harm or damage or loss. And that kind of idea of something that you could measure, something that was manageable, something that was rational and human agency could act on, I'd call that a kind of probabilistic understanding of the world. Now, risk has been redefined almost wholly as in a kind of possibilistic way. So if you stop talking about probabilities and you start talking about possibilities, then that's a whole different kettle of fish. Possibilities are always there. You can't manage them away. There's a kind of existential angst always there. And possibilistic thinking is kind of irrational and fatalistic. It's not something that human agency can act upon to change. Now that second thing, this switch to a possibilistic understanding of risk has really important consequences. Because I would argue it's led to a really fearful attitude to the world. And you see this most amongst young people who do approach the world in a really fearful way, in a way that underestimates our abilities, all of our abilities, to act on the world for good and to change it for the better. And what if thinking, or you might call it worst case thinking, it's really the dominant way of thinking across society. I'd say it's most obvious, it's most tangible in environmental thinking. And as an example as that, if if you have this worst case thinking, what you do is you focus on the irrational, you focus on the worst case. So you focus on the idea that we're going to run out of food in 10 years, rather than planning around a more probable future. And once you start rearranging society around those worst case scenarios, you end up with a very inefficient and irrational society. And that's almost focused, concentrated by the idea that we live in a world that's too complex to understand. And of course, that's a fearful world. It's a world where you do organise everything around the precautionary principle, around the idea of worst case planning, and almost around the idea where actually there's no possibility or point in discussing anything. So there's no point in discussing anything around global warming, because actually we've just got to plan around that worst case scenario. And I'd argue very strongly that's not a sensible way on which to plan the world. Has lots of wider social impacts. I won't talk about these at any great length, but people will be aware of the whole discussion around cotton wool kids who grow up to turn into our snowflake students. And I don't know if people have read The Cuddling of the American Mind. That's got a really interesting idea that we are reinventing the world and remoulding the world around the idea of safetyism. That's the thing that we should plan the world around. And those are difficult issues to plan sensibly around. That has lots of impacts on business and the economy. I would argue that the effect of all this on business and the economy is that research and development is reduced, the privileging of the short-term over long-term planning, corporate social responsibility policies, which people kind of think are something ethical, but actually I think they're largely around reducing risk, do no harm. If you do no harm, you probably do no business. Again, that's not a sensible way in which to plan the world. And I think we've ended up in a world where our political and professional elites are, I would argue, the most risk-averse in history. And for those kind of elites, privileging stability over anything else becomes important, as does contracting out decisions to experts. So politicians don't have to debate or discuss or decide on everything. They just say, the experts say, so this must be what we as a society do. And what that does is it takes risk, it takes decisions about risks away from businesses, away from ordinary people, away from social debate, away from democratic discussion. And it also leads us to a position where we have very low aspirations, a distrust of economic growth and atrophy. What's it mean for actuaries? I'm going to talk a tiny bit about pensions here. I would say that what we as actuaries has done is we kind of followed this shift from probabilistic to possibilistic. We originally used deterministic applications of probability. We now do multiple variations. We use stochastic modelling. We use very complex models. Nothing wrong with any of those things. But we need to just be aware that what we are doing a lot of the time is reflecting social anxieties back on our clients, and we need to think very carefully about whether we're doing that in a way that's helpful to clients or society more widely. Because what it has meant for actuarial advice, and this is where it kind of all gets into this is why it's important for today, is that trustees, sponsors and the regulator have gravitated towards worst case thinking. Actuaries have tended to help with that by what-if modelling. And we get all these I won't go through these in kind of step by step, but we get all these things that we've come to see as the real problems facing DB schemes, using guilt-based methodologies, which lead to then investing your assets in a way that reflects the liabilities rather than investing the assets to get a productive level of growth, and not really understanding our models and that is really problematic for the advice that we give. What that's meant for pension schemes generally is that we've moved from efficient collective pension scheme provision, a pool of assets available for productive investment, to an over-focus on risk, with this risk always negative idea. We've got politicians who crave stability, intolerant to any loss. We've got a regulator worried about their regulation, their reputation, worried about their duty to protect the PPF. And where it's led to us is all the things that Terry mentioned before. We end up with very inefficient provision, especially for a younger generation of workers. So, what's to be done? I think it's really important that we as actuaries and collectively as the pensions industry adhere to the rational. If we talk about risk, we should define what we mean by risk. We can criticise the regulator when they say you need to move into bonds away from productive assets, because we'd argue that that actually maximises the risk that benefits won't be paid in full. And that's what the rest of the regulator and lots of the industry call risk reducing. I'm not just having a go at you, David. This is a general issue with the regulator. We need to hold on to professional judgment, because I think a lot of the time now there's an idea that there's one true answer. There's one true answer to evaluation, and it's self-sufficiency or something called that. Actually, if any professionals need to disagree, innovation and progress do need contestation, discussion, debate, experimentation, and yes, some failure. And we need, as pensions professionals, to practice our profession in the wider public world, because the point is to solve real human problems. And that leads quite nicely, real human problems. Sam.
Right. Okay, yes, so thank you. Very nice to be here. Now, I've chosen as my title a relatively provocative thing here, a story of faith-based risk management. That's what I decided on the train on the way down. So let's see if I can justify that title as I go through this. So anyway, this is me. I'm a lecturer in mathematics at the University of Sheffield, but I'm an elected negotiator for UCU, who represents academic staff, professional staff, people like that at universities. I'm an elected negotiator to discuss what's going on with USS. Okay, so there's the logo. Now, for those who don't know, USS is a pension scheme, the biggest funded defined benefit scheme in the country. It's one of the biggest in Europe. It represents, or its members are people who work at pre-92 universities, so that's the older institutions in the country, and it's huge, 65 billion in assets or thereabouts, and currently it's currently a defined benefit hybrid scheme. It's got a defined benefit and a DC part to it. I'll talk a bit more about the exact makeup of the scheme at the moment. Anyway, I guess most of you do know about USS. It was in the news a lot last year when there was a big dispute over the scheme, which resulted in quite a lot of industrial action at universities. So here's some recent history. So it used to be a final salary scheme until 2011, and at that point there was a valuation, and the valuation showed issues developing, and I wasn't involved way back then, but the final salary section was closed to new entrants, and a career average scheme was introduced for new entrants, although those already in the final salary scheme were allowed to continue. That was supposed to solve the problems, but 3 years later, another actuarial valuation, another triennial valuation, and this time the final salary scheme closed to everyone, and everyone moved into what is the current setup, which is a career average scheme with a cap. So defined benefit up to 55,000 or thereabouts, defined contribution above. Okay, now, fast forward to 2017 and another triennial valuation, and this led to the dispute I mentioned a minute ago. So there was a move by the employers based on the actuarial valuation to close the defined benefit section entirely, which led to big strike action at universities. Now, that move has been reversed. So at the moment, we're in no man's land, waiting for news. In fact, there was some news that's broken this afternoon. I might say a bit more about that later on. But so there was a move to close the DB section, but that has been put on hold while we try to figure out what the future is. Okay, now, my involvement in this went back to around 2014. At that point, I was a member of staff at the University of Sheffield, not heavily involved in the union. I was aware that there'd been changes 3 years before to the pension scheme. I was aware that there was some controversy over what was going on. I naively assumed, or maybe this, you can judge whether it's a naive assumption, that the stuff I was hearing from the union was at one end of the scale. The stuff I was hearing from the employers and the pension scheme was at the other end of the scale, and that the truth would lie somewhere in the middle. So I looked into this. One of the first things I did was read a report that was written by Hilary and Derek Benstead at the back there, which there's a link for. If you find my slides, you can click on the links. Anyway, so this is a 40-something page report, a really detailed report on what was going on with USS. And I can't sing the praises of this report highly enough. This is a superb piece of work. And the interesting thing was that the more I read, the more I decided that the truth was actually much closer, if not entirely, what the unions were saying, because the unions were quoting from this report. Okay. Now, okay, you might say that I've only read one thing, I need to read more widely. I did read more widely, but I also used my judgment. Okay, now what was in this report? Various things that have cropped up already today. Things like the difference between ongoing and closed schemes. David talked about that earlier. These need to be thought about differently for obvious reasons. There was the role of trustees as distinct from that of regulators. They do have different roles. USS is an interesting case because its chief executive was the previous chief executive of the regulator, and there are some questions over whether there's sort of self-regulation going on at USS. Gilts Plus approaches to discount rates. I know that First Actuarial have their FABI index, the First Actuarial Best Estimate Index, and there's certainly something to be said for looking at the discount rate through a number of different lenses to figure out what's going on here. There was de-risking, which I will return to and talk a lot more about, and the potential there for a vicious circle, whereby as you attempt to de-risk and to manage the risks in the scheme, you make the problem worse and you end up chasing your tail. And then in particular, there was a whole chunk on something called Test 1, which became a bit of a point of interest for me. I remember a cup of coffee I shared with a colleague who was a financial mathematician, and I showed him the pages from Derek and Hilary's report and said, I can't understand what's going on here. This seems completely crazy. Can you help me? And of course, financial mathematician sat down saying, of course, let me have a look. 15 minutes later, none of us were any the wiser, and it wasn't Derek and Hilary's fault. It was the underlying structure to this test that took a lot of thinking about. So I devoted a fair bit of time to trying to understand what this Test 1 was all about. Now, I won't go into the full details. It's essentially some kind of self-sufficiency test or some way of some algorithm for approaching self-sufficiency, a kind of long-term funding target or along those lines. But the precise way it's implemented is pretty screwy, if you ask me. Okay, and in fact, you don't need to ask me. This is what Derek and Hilary wrote. They call it the reliance on covenant test. It's deeply flawed for the following reasons, and they gave some reasons here. There have been other things that I've said about it that I think complement and in some places add to what they wrote here, but there are definite concerns over the application of a test which no longer has any sort of, once you agree to go with this test, it dictates an awful lot of stuff that may not be sensible. Okay. So I did try to understand what was going on, and I made some videos. I'm an educator. I thought, why not educate? And in fact, my target audience here was actually finance directors at universities. I don't know how many of them watched them. I do know that Bill Galvin and co at USS did watch them because they've commented on them and commended me for my clarity in these videos. So if you want to understand what Test 1 is, try and find these videos on YouTube. Now, let's fast forward a bit because all this was in this was in the distant past, but it was all, 2014 was where it started. It kind of rumbled on for a few years, got us to 2017 and the next valuation. Then there was this big industrial dispute, which was odd in that it wasn't a case of us saying, we want you to put more money into this scheme. It was around the valuation itself. The dispute was all focused on, we don't believe the numbers you're coming up with here. So it was a slightly strange dispute that ended not with the employers saying, okay, we'll put more money in, the employers saying, okay, we will agree to an independent panel to report on what's going on within USS. So there was something that we called the Joint Expert Panel formed. 6 members on that panel plus a chair, Joanne Seegers chaired. 3 of these members were nominated by the unions, and 3 of them were nominated by the employers. They came up with a unanimous report, which was published in September last year, which fundamentally vindicated precisely what Hilary and Derek had said in 2014. All of the arguments they'd made were rubber-stamped by this independent panel. In particular, they commented on all of these aspects of de-risking and of Test 1. They talked about evaluation that was model-driven rather than model-informed. All sorts of good stuff in there. It's a substantial report, about 60 pages, but it did vindicate Derek and Hilary's work, plus the stuff that we've been doing within UCU to try and push the same arguments. Okay. Now, unfortunately, that didn't have the effect that it might have done. We'd hoped that that would provide a solution to the ongoing disagreements over USS. It did swing the employers in this situation round to so that we're now in a situation where the members of the scheme, as represented by the unions, are roughly speaking on the same page as the employers. Where it hasn't had any effect, or a marginal effect, is within USS itself. And that's the problem that we're struggling with right now. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about precisely what Test 1 says. I'm going to put you some numbers up, because a number of you are actuaries, and you know, why not put some numbers up? These were some numbers that have been confirmed in accuracy by USS, but they were things that I derived using some cash flow data that they sent. It was a very simple calculation. I mean, I've not done anything clever, by the way, not half as clever as what you guys do. But I think this made an interesting point, and this was a point that Derek and Hilary had asked USS in 2014 that they hadn't answered. It took me a year of pestering USS until they gave me enough data to come up with the answers myself. They refused to give these figures for a long time. What does it show? Well, their Test 1 self-sufficiency algorithm is all about getting close to self-sufficiency by year 20. Now, they say the way to do that is to de-risk so that your technical provisions rise far enough that the gap to self-sufficiency is small enough for the employers to handle. But one thing they never answered was, okay, well, what happens under your assumptions to your expected value of the assets under those situations? And that's what this table shows. So in each case, the year 20 self-sufficiency liabilities have the same figure, but depending on how much you de-risk, and it's quite cryptic, September de-risking, November de-risking, this was references to 2 different documents, hence the 2 different names there. But in both cases, their target for the technical provisions moves up so that it's 10 billion away from the self-sufficiency valuation. The question is whether that's a sensible thing to do. And this is a question that USS never tried to answer, that employers were never given information on. The rough take-home from this is that if you de-risk, then you expect to reduce the asset growth. And the question is, and you expect, and so you can see what's going on here. The liabilities increase at year 20 by de-risking, and your expected asset growth decreases, at which point there is a genuine question as to whether it's what you want to do. Is de-risking the right approach? This doesn't tell you whether it's the right approach or not. This gives you some data to make informed decisions. This is evidence-based thinking. And this is what USS have resisted all the way. So going back to my title about faith-based risk management, they have resisted talking about these numbers, discussing the evidence in favour of, it's okay, Test 1 does the job, we leave it to Test 1. Okay. So there were various things written about these. Mike Otsuka's a name that some of you may know, talked about a large and demonstrable mistake. You read it. It's not words I would have used, although mainly because I didn't dare. But I think it's kind of fair. An error in their thinking, not an error in their calculations. But you may have looked at those numbers before and said, okay, those numbers are just a single point on a distribution, which is true. And we're back to probabilistic thinking along the lines of that Hilary was talking about. And it's true that those numbers I showed you were prudently adjusted forecasts, okay? They weren't best estimates, they were prudently adjusted forecasts. But you might say, okay, what about the tail risk? Has that been controlled with the de-risking? Now, these two graphs were things that USS showed to Imperial when they went to give a presentation there. And they show, these are 10-year projections, not 20-year projections, but under two different assumptions, one in which you de-risk, one in which you don't. Now, you won't be able to see the numbers from where you're sat, but the key point is where these arrows fall, which is the sort of 1% worst case here. The numbers don't matter themselves. The interesting thing is that the 1% worst case is almost indistinguishable whether you de-risk or not over this timescale. They reduce the volatility, but in doing so, they've shifted the mean to the left. So this is when you don't de-risk, and this is when you do. You won't be able to see from where you're sat. The slides are on my Twitter account, so you can have a look for yourself. Now, this was 10 years. You might say that's not a long enough timescale. I asked USS to provide 20-year graphs. They took 4 months to come up with them, but they have now given them to me. I can't tell you what's in them because USS's modus operandi is utmost secrecy. Well, I can't tell you precisely what they say, but I will say they show pretty much exactly the same picture. The tail risk has not been reduced over that timescale by de-risking. So the question is the tail risk reduced over any timescale by de-risking? And that is an open question and something that should be addressed by thinking about evidence and not on faith. Right, I think I've talked for longer than I should. There's some resources. If you go to my Twitter account, you'll find these slides and you can click and read things for yourself, which I'd encourage you to do. Right, I'll stop there. Thank you. So over to Terry then.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I was just going to say that you may be relieved to know that I've got absolutely no slides. I'm not an intellectual. I'm a proud postman who became a union rep and absolutely honoured to have spent my life representing fellow working people, which has brought me to this point. There's been lots of reward in doing that. I want to thank First Actuarial, their first ever conference, and I'm quite honoured that they've asked me to speak at it. And particularly I want to thank Derek Banstead and Hilary Saltz, who've been with us on this journey that I'm going to talk about, and we've become friends, I like to think. It's still a business relationship. We're probably paying for the after party, so make the most of it while you're But I like to think that we've become good friends. Now, necessity is the mother of invention, and so to tell our story as basically as I can tell it, in Royal Mail Group, we're talking about 120,000 people. We ran into a problem a couple of years ago where the business said to us, it's now a privatised business, that they needed to close our DB scheme, which had moved to career average. It had a number of sticking plasters on it through the years to try and protect it. But our other problem was we had 80,000 people in the DB scheme, circa, and 40,000 people in a DC scheme. So it had been closed for 10 years for new entrants, our scheme. DC was meant to be the answer, but when I inherited this brief, that was the problem that was in front of us. So the 80,000 people didn't want their DB scheme to close, and along with other issues, which was all around employment, standard of living and retirement security, we went into a big dispute with our employer, and we had the backing of a 90% yes vote on something like an 84% turnout, massive. So huge pressure point on everyone to start trying to think differently to find a solution. The DB scheme was fully funded. I raised the point earlier with David, but the contribution from the employer, because of the rules around evaluation, etc., meant that it was their contribution would have to go up to in excess of 50% of people's pay. It was something like 1.2 billion going forward that they would have to put in, and they weren't even making that type of money. So we knew we had a problem. We had 80,000 people who were insistent that they wanted their pension protected, their future retirement security protected. And we had 40,000 people in the DC scheme that, quite frankly, was inadequate. There was different levels in the DC scheme, so there's a bit of nanny state to where we're going in a minute. But in our DC scheme, there was a number of levels, and the vast majority of people had stuck at the lower level, which would not give them outcomes so that they could have dignity in retirement and security in retirement. And we were constantly trying to improve on those DC schemes. So we had these two audiences. So from a union's point of view, our problem was if you was asking people just to take action over their pension, if we were saying DC was inadequate, then you'd have 40,000 people that would be effectively saying, so you're asking me to go on strike for people in the DB scheme when you've left me in a DC scheme. So we had this sort of dilemma. So anyway, we got together with First Actuarial and we said, and I suppose it came from guts really. It came from the position of saying, well, at some point in history, someone must have thought DB schemes were a good idea. Wage and retirement schemes, occupational pension schemes, running alongside your state pension gives you that level of security in retirement. We've seen what's been going on with the state pension. They're pushing it further and further out. The government saying increasingly that they can't afford it. And yet the pension scheme, coming forward, people's outcomes coming forward suggest most people are going to be heavily reliant on the state if they're going to take any form of retirement or unless they're going to work till they drop. So, our thoughts were, if it was a good idea once, how can we, where's the innovation in pensions? Because the only show in town, the only thing on offer was DC. And David said there's only 3% of DB schemes still open to new entrants. This is a massive problem for society, but our problem was, of course, this is what drove what we've done, was our particular problem. So we tested each other, and sometimes it got a bit heated with Derek and Hilary, over the issue of how could we come up with something different. And originally we came up with a scheme. We wanted, as a union, we wanted people to have a wage in retirement. That's what we wanted. That's what we think is desperately missing. And how can we perhaps find a different way of doing that and get an agreement with our employer? So we came up with a scheme which we called the Wage and Retirement Scheme, Winners, we called it. And that was based upon, that was giving flexibility, but what it was based on was saying you do evaluation each year, and then whatever someone's built up is then promised to them in DB. So that's promised. What you wasn't doing was promising 30 years out. So we was looking to do that each year. What the employer said to us is that still would cause them a massive problem on their balance sheet, because we was also insisting that all of our members, all 120,000, went into the same scheme. So we did away with inequality in pension provision across the Royal Mail Group. So we eventually came up with our scheme, which is designed on a traditional DB scheme, 1/80th of pensionable pay, 3/80ths lump sum. The lump sum is DB in nature, so the lump sum of our scheme will be that there's an evaluation each year, and then that will be guaranteed. Whatever's been built up each year will be guaranteed to you in the lump sum. The wage and retirement element will be done via CDC. But to have that scheme, we needed legislation change. We've worked with the Department of Work and Pensions. We've worked with the Pension Minister. It's got cross-party support. We met the Shadow Minister yesterday, and we're delighted to say that this has grown in support, this concept of developing a wage in retirement. We've modelled it to the point we went right back to 1925, so to do the modelling on how this scheme would have coped. Because what it means, of course, on the CDC, the wage in retirement element, there is a risk. The risk is on the collective, if you like, the collective, in so much as you could have a moment in time when that pension has to be reduced. The target is CPI plus 1, is it? Yeah. So equivalent of RPI. That is our target. On the modelling we've done, on most occasions throughout since 1925, you would see an increase. Might be different increases. Might be a year when you can say CPI might be 2%, but we can only put it up 1%. Could be 2. It could be a lot more. Many of the occasions on the modelling, it's a lot more than that. But there is the odd year, and I think it was in the Great Depression. There was twice you'd have had to put it down by something like 5%, the pension. The main driver, I think, as we've built it up for me is, although you may have to say to someone in retirement and someone building up their pension, so this is intergenerationally fair, in our opinion, you may have to say to someone at a moment in time, this year your pension is either not going up or it might be reduced, either pension in payment or one being built up. But to me, in balance, when you do the modelling and how often you may have to say that, which is minute, that is so much better than saying to someone, by the way, your pension scheme is closed, or your company has gone bust and you go into the pension protection fund, when you'd see a reduction anyway, more than likely, in your pension scheme. This scheme can stay open because on a yearly basis you're making the adjustments to ensure the scheme can stay open. So As we stand here today, we understand and we're very hopeful that a bill is imminent and will go to as soon as parliamentary time will allow, and that will allow us to build our pension scheme, which absolutely will give people not only a lump sum at point of retirement, but will give them a wage in retirement where 50% of that would even go to their dependent if something happens to them as well. So we think ideally DB is the gold standard, and we say to everybody, if you can defend your DB scheme, then you defend it with your life, which we've done on a number of occasions. When it comes to the point where you just can no longer defend it, there has to be a better alternative than just DC, because that's what's there for people now. Anyone going into employment now will be going into a DC scheme. So in terms of the world of pensions, you guys, now I'm not an intellectual, I told you that, but many of you I'm sure are, I do challenge back and say, where is the innovation in pensions industry? And Matthew Taylor was talking about people having an influence in social change, etc. Well, I believe this is the moment now for the pensions industry to have a voice and start having a voice about social change. I think financial institutions should be doing the same thing, because if we all of us, just continue to walk on the other side of the street, then I dread to think what this is going to look like in 20, 30, 40 years' time for a generation that has made no real, put nothing aside for their retirement, with a government saying we can't afford a state pension. I think you're going so far back in time, it's unbelievable. To us, and our enthusiasm and passion for this, for me, absolutely, I genuinely believe what we're doing here, we're going first, but I think it will drive innovation in the pensions industry so that even you could have CDC schemes for the self-employed. This shouldn't just be for companies where people are directly employed. If you look at the nature of work at the moment, this could be a beverage moment for pension schemes. And I think that's massive. And you'd understand when you get into the detail of this stuff, and if you come on board, and we'll be sharing it all the way along the line, Hilary, we are so enthusiastic about this, because although this is going to protect our members in the CWU and our members in the Royal Mail Group, I absolutely believe now, I'm convinced this is going to make a major contribution to pensions going forward and drive innovation, which will keep all you guys employed, but also which is desperately needed, because surely we're not suggesting that the only answer going forward is totally inadequate DC schemes that tick the box. And this is my example I would give to people. So I've got 3 children, 2 of them are in their 30s, I've got 6 grandchildren. My 3 children, 2 of them in their 30s, 1 nearly in their 30s, there's only 1 of them that is in what I would call a proper decent pension scheme. And they're already going into their 30s. So they will not have the provisions of a decent pension scheme. Only 1 of them is on the property ladder. There's a problem here in society. This pensions industry, can make a massive contribution with it. I'd ask you to sort of get behind us, really. Give us some support, but give it some thought yourself. Because beyond what we've managed to get agreed with our employer, and we've convinced the Department of Work and Pensions and everything else, beyond that, I think there's a whole load of innovation that can come behind that. Thank you very much.